welcome to another episode of Subject to Interpretation, where we dive into the complexities and emerging trends in the field of interpretation. I'm your host, Maria Ceballos-Wallis, and today we're exploring a timely and critical topic: the impact of AI on interpretation, the guidelines needed to navigate this new landscape, and the future of our profession. Joining me are two distinguished guests who are at the forefront of these discussions. First, we have Dr. Ann Silvestri, Senior Coordinator for Translation Training and Curriculum at the National Center of Interpretation at the University of Arizona. Holly is also the chair of the Public Relations Committee for Safe AI Task Force. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Our second guest is Shawn Norris, a leader in healthcare language access and president of the Florida Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. He's also a commissioner for the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters and brings an invaluable perspective on AI's impact on the deaf community and language accessibility. Welcome, Shawn.
Thank you for having us.
Let's start by looking at the big picture. AI is rapidly transforming many sectors, including interpretation. Now, on October 30th of 2023, an executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence was issued by the U.S. government. Now, it does not explicitly mention automated interpreting by artificial intelligence, or AI x AI, as sometimes we see it written on papers, or also known as AI-driven interpreting. However, it does establish broad principles and guidelines that could impact the development and deployment of AI technologies, including those for interpreting. Now, in advance of this, however, in June of 2023, the Safe AI Task Force was officially launched by a group of interpreting industry thought leaders, creating the Safe AI Task Force. Now, that is known as the Stakeholders Advocating for Fair and Ethical AI in Interpreting. And certainly this is a welcome and proactive approach for our industry. So with all of that said, Holly, could you explain how AI is disrupting our field and where the Safe AI Task Force fits into this landscape?
Sure. Let's start by doing a little bit of an analogy. This was triggered this morning because I was looking at the news before I came on here, and they are disrupting landlines. They're going away. And I like to make the analogy that AI is going to be as disruptive to the interpreting profession as cell phones were to the telephone industry. I don't mean to imply that AI is going to make it go away and on the human level, but it gives you an idea of the vast magnitude that this kind of gave to the industry at the moment that ChatGPT, which was really the trigger event, introduced itself to the world. To give you an idea of how amazingly quick people, gravitated towards ChatGPT a little bit faster than they did towards cell phones, because at that point they were, remember the old bricks with the pull-out antenna? Not anymore, right? It's a little computer in your pocket. But ChatGPT versus, let's say Netflix. Netflix took as an app about a year to get 1 million users. ChatGPT, 5 days. So people were really drawn to this particular instance of a technological advancement that sort of shook everything to its foundation. And if you look at the press, if you go back and look at the press at that time, you can definitely see that we were at the apex of or at the beginning of a very big hype cycle in the press with respect to this invention. People were experimenting with it. They were saying, oh my God, it's going to take over people's jobs. It thinks, it does this. It sounds so natural. Human beings are in so much trouble. And here we are, still around, still interpreting as humans. I think to a certain extent, yes, this has shaken people to their foundation, in the sense that there was a lot of fear given the hype cycle at the very beginning. The press was saying, 40% of jobs are going to be replaced by robots. And of course, interpreting was one of those, and people were really, really afraid. We had just gone through the COVID issue where everything sort of moved to remote, and remote was stickier, I think, than we expected it to be, for a lot of reasons. One of which, of course, is the cost involved and the ease with which people could find interpreters now, because you were not looking only locally for on-site, but across the world, basically, to fill that need. And so this new invention on top of that made people really, really, really nervous. So Safe AI decided, let's get some data on this, because a lot of what's appearing in the press are these little snippets of what people think in their little interaction with ChatGPT, and projections without any real data of like, does this actually interpret? And is this really interpreting, or is it really just a collection of apps that make it seem like it's interpreting? And it's the latter, obviously. So we, as a group, decided, okay, we're going to pay for this research because no one was doing it. And we formed a committee. We gathered money, and we paid CSA Research, which is very well known in the field, right, for doing this type of research. We created the survey. There were some bumps along the road, obviously, because we wanted to distribute the survey at the same time to both the speaking and the signed community. But given the fact that it takes much longer to interpret, because we had to interpret it, right, a spoken survey in ASL, they decided to sort of split at that moment and do two separate parallel surveys, because we had a coalition that included deaf and hard of hearing and ASL interpreters, and we were very cognizant of the fact that we needed to respond as one unit. So we went ahead, we did the survey, tons of data was created. And as a result of that, we created the guidelines. Does that answer your question? I seem to be talking for a very long time, and I wanted to make sure I got that in.
Definitely, Holly. That's a really great introduction to this topic. And you've definitely brought me to my next question, which is to ask Shawn to talk about from his perspective in the ASL community and in the deaf and hard of hearing community, how are interpreters reacting to AI's impact and everything the information that you've started to gather?
Well, Holly touched on the Coalition for Sign Language Equity and Technology, also known as CSLET. They were under a different name when they produced that report originally. So we do appreciate their hard work in giving us that information as well. Being involved in the guidance committee, helping develop that guidance that we published earlier this summer. And then also my experience with the sign language community. I would say that in general, sign language interpreters generally feel comfortable with it. There is some apprehension in that it might eventually come for our jobs, so to speak, just like spoken language interpreters feel that right now. We do understand that we have probably a bigger moat than spoken language interpreters do, due to the three-dimensional aspect. And while it is a widely used language, American Sign Language is widely used, it could also be considered almost a language of lesser diffusion, in the sense of it's kind of hard to get those native speakers to get that language into the machine learning programs and all that. So I would say generally some apprehension. I know many sign language interpreters use things like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, and the like to maybe do prep for conference interpreting, to do prep for other kinds of interpreting, that kind of thing. Maybe even they're probably even using it in their own personal lives or businesses. But generally not as much fear. But when it comes to what CSLET had produced in their report, there was a lot of concerns about the end users and the concerns of the lack of diversity and inclusion that is embedded into these programs, because you think about it, the majority of these machine learning programs are developed based on English. That's our lingua franca. That's something that's obviously ASL is not a part of, grammar and syntax for American Sign Language has nothing to do with English. And so there's always that concern, okay, is there going to be further biases and discrimination just kind of brought along within to those systems? And then, of course, there's the ethical concerns about when is it appropriate to use AI by AI. So the AI X AI that you've talked about. So the artificial interpreting done by, or the artificial intelligence doing automated interpreting. So that's always a concern. In fact, this year, as I've done video remote interpreting for healthcare, I've had many deaf people, in particular, a little bit those who are a little more older, when they see me on the screen, they're like, "Are you AI?" They'll ask me directly if I'm AI because they've seen some AI produced avatars where it's based on actual humans, but they made programs where they could type in a sentence and it can give out very basic commands and things like that. So they always ask me, "Are you AI?" And that to me just speaks to how pervasive it has become. And obviously, the timing for the guidance to be out there is really important, that it's impacting not just our spoken language community, but also our sign language community, to the point where the average patient is now concerned, am I even getting accurate information? Is this even a real human being I'm talking to? Those are always those concerns we have.
So before we talk about the guidelines, which are extremely important and I would say are a trendsetter really in our industry, let's talk about the intent for the Safe AI Task Force. We've done a couple of different podcasts with different over the years, looking at different groups of people, and one of the slogans that comes out is "Nothing about us without us." And that comes from a civil rights movement. And so it seems to me that if we do not insert ourselves into the conversation, then the conversation will go around us, and then we will have to deal with the consequences. Let's talk a little bit about just the proactive nature of Safe AI Task Force, and how important it is for us to assert ourselves as interpreting professionals at this point, perhaps something that we may have not ever done before.
Absolutely. That's the foundational belief behind the creation of the task force, right? Many of us are translators and interpreters. I happen to be both myself, although it's not true broadly across the spectrum in our profession. And I, amongst others in our committee, had watched, and don't come for me, please, I'm also a translator, but I had watched translators when sort of machine translation sort of entered the sphere, play the ostrich and sort of stick their head in the sand and go, "Oh, it's going to be fine. We don't need to worry. Humans will be better than this all the time." And they are, absolutely. But there was such a need that this basically now has become, one of the major providers of, translation in the world. Raw translation or, post editing has become a big thing. And the translators never really got their say as to what tools needed to be used, how, etc. And we kind of didn't want that to happen in interpreting. We said, "Hey, wait, we need to be part of this conversation. And we're not going to do that unless we actually are part of the conversation and try to insert ourselves and say, hey, listen, we can't be an afterthought, right? This is an entire profession that you guys are looking to change, and you haven't talked to us about what we do, about how we want it to change for the better, so that the end consumer or end user, I hate that term, but or the client, right? And those are the terms that sort of get thrown around, is paid attention to as well. But also the person doing the interpreting can give you some kind of guideline as to how it should be done and what kind of control the end user should have over this system, not just for forgive the terminology, just the tech bros going, hey, we've got this great thing, let's apply it. Like, no, back up the truck, tech bros. How about we have a little conversation about this? And we learn perhaps what we do other than just the rigorous nature of transferring the message, because there are other things that we bring to the table. And there are certain situations in which case we're not going to be able to be replaced because of the very nature of the interpreting encounter. So let's not promise, rainbows and unicorns before we have the conversation about what we actually do and where this is appropriate. We're not, and I do want to say this clearly, we're not Luddites. We do believe that this has the potential to absolutely open up the language access aspect of things and placed properly where perhaps an interpreter isn't appropriate. This could be a game changer for a lot of people in the US and worldwide, obviously. But let's not put the cart before the horse, and let's talk about how to properly insert this into, the sphere of types of interpreting that can happen.
And I see Shawn shaking his head. I wanted to make a comment that of information that has been shared with me in the past, that the sign language community, the deaf and hard of hearing community, has always has always had a direct connection to technology via interpretation, camera interpretation, and so technology is not, I don't want to say it's not their enemy, but technology has been accepted as part of the way that services are provided, far more than actual spoken language interpreting in terms of video and all of that. But I see you shaking your head about what Holly is saying. So tell me about that.
Honestly, a lot of the technology, the tools that we use today is thanks to the communities that have disabilities, because of their needs and the adaptations that have to be developed to help them to be just as equal productive citizens in our life. They have that ability now because we've developed technology and tools for them to have that share. And then we get to benefit as a result, really understanding that how universal design is beneficial for everyone. I remember going to a conference on disability, and one of the speakers, who themselves were disabled, said, one day we're all going to be disabled. And you know what? There's a lot of truth in that. As we get older, different things will happen, maybe not, but the likelihood is we're all going to be impacted in different ways. And why not be more inclusive in that design now? I think just from my family, both my parents are deaf. I grew up having TTYs, so the teletype devices where you put a phone receiver on it to connect to relay, and then video relay services started in the early 2000s. Texting was something that deaf people used for decades before texting became the main use for cell phones, right? Because now if someone calls my phone, I know it's a telemarketer. I know it's not an actual human being, right? Like, who's calling me? Just text me.
So true.
Just text me. I remember my dad having like one of those giant Nokia phones, and you had like an adapter for a full keyboard that would plug into the bottom of it. And that led to the, advent of full keyboards with phones. And now everyone has full keyboards with like, nobody even thinks about it anymore. But it's because of those accessibility needs that were developed. I also wanted to touch on Holly talked about it a little bit as well, where the tech bros and they look at language, the machine translation capabilities that AI is able to do to a certain extent, and it's just a selling item. They're trying to differentiate themselves, but every single AI company has been saying, oh, it can do translation, it can do interpretation, it can do this and that. And it can to a certain degree, but not to the degree that we would want. If you asked anybody, oh, would you rather have 100% of something or 80% of something? Everybody would be like, I want 100%. Well, okay, and that's what the CSA survey pointed out. They're like, well, the more critical situation, the more they wanted the human involved. in the interpretation. So when the stakes are low, then they're fine. It makes me think of for want of a nail. If you've heard that phrase or that story, little things over the course of time can have dramatic effects onto a society as a whole. So we shouldn't think, no matter how small our communication is with somebody, we shouldn't take that and say, oh, well, that's not consequential. You don't know what could be consequential. A lot of things can happen. I have been involved in cases where one little misunderstanding and all of a sudden a deaf person's in jail for 3 days with no interpreter. And then you go in there as an interpreter and you interpret and you're like, this person didn't do what you guys said they did. And you kept them here without an interpreter so that you couldn't actually interview them. So now there's civil rights abuses and things like that, all because of a simple misunderstanding. Language is power. Language is based on culture. Language is based on values, identity. But we're so quick to be like, oh, I'm just the interpreter, or I'm just the translator, or, oh, this AI can do this and that. We're devaluing something that is so crucial and part of our being. If you think about it, in clinical settings, in mental health settings, 80, 90% of diagnostics is based on communication, right? How vital is communication? But we're so quick to dismiss it. And I think it's because that's a hearing person privilege. I would say that because we hear, we talk, it's all around us. We're not isolated. But to someone who has been isolated, who has to wait and drive 2 hours to go meet some other deaf people who can sign, you see the value of communication. You see how important it is and how if that's taken away from you, you understand what a privilege it was to have.
Now, this brings us to our next topic, which is the survey that you did regarding interpreters' thoughts on AI. So, Holly, I know you had a reply, or I guess an afterthought to what Shawn was saying. Go ahead and tell us what you were thinking, but also let's move on to talk about the survey and the perception of interpreters to all of this.
Absolutely. I just wanted to say, to reiterate and perhaps put it in other words, what Shawn was saying, like communication is not a simple thing. The problem with, dividing it up into use cases where AI can be used is that's not how communication works. You can't just say, oh, all, ordering of food in a restaurant is a really simple use case. Therefore, that's where AI could probably benefit from being used, because you never know, there could be a left turn at any moment. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't want to go into a ramen place and have an AI chatbot, take my order and not be able to ask them what are the ingredients, because I have certain food allergies that could lead to anaphylactic shock and death. So even in the most simple exchange, some waiter taking your order, there's always a possibility that this could go way off the rails. So, the thought that, we can determine that any communication is going to be A, B, or C, simple, medium, or hard. I disagree with profoundly. Now, talking about the perceptions on automated interpreting survey, which is what you referred to before. Yes, there's a lot of data to unpack. Some of the key findings, and the perceptions survey was sent out to everybody in the sense that there were questions for end users, questions for interpreters, questions for the tech side, the tech creators, questions for language industry, sellers, the companies. So, but we did find that, and I think that this is a factor in the responses, that most of the responses we got, a vast majority, were from interpreters. And that, I think, is a reflection of the time, right? Everything in the press was saying that, translating, interpreting was going to go by the wayside and it was going to be done by robots. And so interpreters really were terrified, and they flocked to the survey. We also had an overwhelming number of medical interpreters. I think that's due to the fact that the people on the board or the admin of the committee were primarily in the medical interpreting area. And so we were reaching out to contacts to tell people about the survey. And therefore, there's that little bias in it, in the sense that, you only get who you ask to take this. And the other thing I would say is that it's very, very hard to get end users to take a survey. Anyone who's ever, been in a store and they ask you, oh, could you take a survey? Like even at the post office, they want you to, click and tell us about the service. Nobody ever does it. No one wants those. So it was really hard to capture some of that end users and the consumers, but we did get enough that was statistically significant. So getting to the key findings, use and testing of automated captioning, about 27% of respondents at that snapshot moment in time, right? Things have changed since, had tested automated captioning moderately to extensively. That's a very small number. I think if we put the survey out now, it would be very different. There are a lot more people experimenting with it. Of those users, of that 27%, about half reported that they thought that there was growing integration of AI in interpreting services. And if you look at it now from the perspective of the companies, absolutely, all of them are onboarding, AI in some fashion, or at least that's what they're saying. With respect to acceptance and skepticism, the study revealed, a combination, right? Which is normal, I think. Any new technology is going to, give you that kind of a mixed reaction. I think at first people are a little stunned by what it can do, and then they start to dig in and go, yeah, but this, and this, right? There was a consensus about the potential of AI to absolutely positively contribute, but at the same time, there was concern about deployment, respecting stakeholders' rights, needs, and preferences. That was a big challenge for the people who took the survey. And then financial applications, of course, cost considerations is the gorilla in the room. The financial aspect of AI adoption was clearly identified, with a lot of, particularly the interpreters, viewing automation as a cost reduction strategy, despite potential sacrifices in quality. But the study also noted that there was variability in acceptance based on who bears the cost, right? People were asked, well, if you had to pay the cost as an end user, would you prefer to pay a lower cost with AI or a higher cost with a human? And, there was variability as a result. So it's a complex interplay between the financial considerations, quality of service, and ethical standards that we've always struggled with. It just became very clear once we introduced AI into it. Transparency and informed consent questions. An overwhelming majority of respondents advocated for clear disclosure when AI is used in interpreting. I think we can even see that people were very nervous and still maintain that nervous nature with respect to the technology in Shawn's story earlier. It underscores the importance of all the parties being aware of and consenting to the use of automated solutions, which currently is not the case in a lot of places. I think as a general rule in the United States, language access is kind of a, here you go, one size fits all kind of a thing that's presented to people. There's not a choice solution, even though there is a variety of options available. I think the companies present it as a, here you go. Ethical considerations were central. A majority of people agreed that using machines for interpreting is not right. Generally speaking, the sentiment was particularly strong amongst service recipients and interpreters who view the shift towards AI with a lot of apprehension. And then the final point we found was there was diverse perspectives. The data highlights, a divide in opinions about the use of AI when no human interpreter is available particularly. There was nearly an equal split among the people who prefer interpretation that's automated to no interpretation at all. Highlighting the need for the service, but also people's apprehension with, not being able to communicate. like Shawn had said earlier, it's a real privilege to be able to communicate.
Can you give us an idea of the level of sophistication that the survey takers had in terms of their familiarity with AI, whether they had used some mode or form of it in the past or were currently using it?
There weren't questions about that. We had to come up with the survey pretty quickly, right? Because given the nature of how fast things were moving, the Facebook motto, move fast and break things, they were definitely moving fast and really breaking a lot of stuff. And we needed to sort of say, hey, there's a stop sign up ahead. We need to get some data on this. So we didn't think about asking about AI. And honestly, if you look at that particular point in time, AI wasn't even on anyone's, bandwidth. They were just stunned when this was sort of plopped in. If you look at the press at that time, and I did go back and look just before this, and I was absolutely stunned at like all the articles were like, look, this new thing. AI has been integrated in a lot of things before that, but nobody paid attention to it until it could, quote unquote, use language and think, right? It
I
doesn't.
mean, airlines have been using it for years,
Absolutely.
all the jokes about, calling an airline or calling another service and pressing 000
Oh my
because you
God,
don't want to get
yes.
the automated. I mean, it's been there. It's when you go into somebody's website, the little bot chat comes up.
At the bank tellers.
It's been there, it's been there for a long time. I guess you're right. I mean, it's slowly, gotten in there and it's pervasive, but we hadn't realized until we could do something with it, perhaps.
Right, absolutely. And until I think there was a lot of use cases in the past where well, first of all, if you're not affected, you're not paying attention to it, right? I remember there were bank tellers that were really frustrated with the idea that ATMs were taking over. Now you can't find a bank teller. Literally, there's just an ATM and one lonely guy in the bank, like on a Tuesday, you know. So there's that aspect to it, but there's also, like you said, people were just introducing this everywhere. Now people are paying attention because it's sort of like, oh, wait, we're getting kind of close to something that could approximate a human when we're talking about avatars and we're talking about it. Language was kind of the last barrier because it's always been attached to thought and like existence, right? I think, therefore I am, and therefore I use language was kind of the triad that people had associated in their mind. And then once it sort of sounded so fluent in the translations and everything, people were like, oh my God, it can think and do all these things. We're close to the singularity. We're nowhere near the singularity. Calm down, people. But it did, to the general public, appear like that.
Now, Shawn, you're laughing. Tell me your perspective. Tell me about how you see this survey. And I believe that Holly mentioned that there was a parallel survey done for the ASL and deaf and hard of hearing community.
I'm laughing because I remember my first experience with ChatGPT almost 2 years ago now, really, because I started hearing about it in the tech community, which I did a lot of work in. And I was like, oh, let me try this out. And I was floored. I think it was like ChatGPT 2 something, maybe 2.5. I think I was using, like, it was still kind of in beta or something like that. It wasn't like super out there yet. And I was floored. I was like, what in the world? But when the novelty wears away and once you've used it, you realize, oh, it's just another cheap parlor trick, really. Like, not to minimize it too much, but it's like if you ask this AI the same question 5 different times, you might very possibly get 5 different answers. And that's how you know there's no intelligence associated with it. It's just math, just really, really good math. That's all it is. It just assigns weights and probabilities based on the words that were used in your question or prompt. And then each word it develops, it changes the trajectory. And that's why sometimes you'll get one answer like, oh, that's correct. And then you'll get another answer like, well, what was that? Like, it wasn't even the same answer. Why? there's only really one or two possible good answers for this question. Why did it go over here? And it's because it was like, oh, this might be where we're going with it. There's no actual understanding. So it's very funny to play around with that. Actually, Apple released a paper in the past week or two talking about that, and they demonstrated how far we are from AGI, artificial general intelligence or generative intelligence, where there's actual true intelligence and not just this, personification we're putting onto it or what we're projecting onto the machines. And it demonstrated what I talked about, where if you ask it the same thing a few times, you'll get different answers almost every time. And that's kind of frustrating to us as humans, because we're very much like, no, this is the pattern, this is what we can expect. And we don't like when things change for no apparent reason. That's very upsetting to us as humans, right? As far as the sign language part for the research, I did touch on it before about the end user concerns. There's also the concerns about the requester and provider, making sure that they actually understand how much AI is being used. So that really lines up to what was done with CSA and spoken languages. There was also the ethical concerns. What does the bias and discrimination look like? The cultural diversity, how is it being used? Is it responsible? Is it ethical, et cetera? Let's see what else. And they're concerned about if something bad were to happen, who is liable? Who is accountable for this? I had a friend who, when they were working on their dissertation in their research, they actually produced a study where the difference between a really good, skilled, experienced veteran interpreter and a new interpreter is the experienced interpreter, when they made mistakes, they knew it and they could fix it in real time, right? And it was done, it was very seamless. Whereas the new interpreter made just as much, if not a little bit more mistakes than the veteran interpreter, but they didn't recognize the errors they made. And that's the concern we have with AI. It doesn't recognize the errors it makes, because it does make errors. So who is going to catch those errors in real time, especially in a setting in education? You're doing an IEP meeting, an individualized education plan. Those are legal binding documents. What's happening? Who catches the errors? That kind of thing. Medical, legal, general community support. Maybe you have someone offering services, charities, things like that. Basic misunderstandings can occur that can lead to drastic situations. And I realize it kind of feels like I'm ringing the alarm bells and making something a little bit bigger than what it is, but it's really just more pointing out, like, this is a slippery slope and we have to be very careful and very intentional about it. Which is why in the guidance that we published, we talked about Principle 2, evidence of improving safety and well-being for end users. You can't just say, well, it doesn't hurt anybody. You don't know that yet. We don't know. There's so many things that are happening. We don't know the end result until 20, 30, 40 years later. Then we're like, oh, that was a bad idea. Really? So now we're pushing for, no, you need to show why, how is it beneficial? Almost kind of like the European Union's take on things. It's really not about, oh, is there any harm? No, it's more about, how is there any benefit to society? How is there any benefit to the public? And taking a more proactive approach instead of a reactive approach.
So, Shawn, in addition to enhancing safety and well-being and demonstrating that this isn't just a do no harm kind of technology, what other guidelines were produced from the findings?
The other guidelines or guidance that we produced were 4 basic principles is what we settled upon. And the reason we call it a guidance is because we felt like guidelines are going to be a little bit more specific and should be allocated to different industries and based on their particular use cases and scenarios. So medical interpretation would have its own kind of niche and guidelines that they could probably publish. I know NCIHC, the National Council of Interpreting in Healthcare, had published something recently based on the guidance that we produced this past summer, which was wonderful. I encourage all other interpreting organizations to do the same for their members, for their industries. We really just wanted to present something like, here's a framework that you can take and run with. So the first principle we think is the most important is end user autonomy. And end user autonomy is not just the person who speaks a language other than English. It's also the person who's providing the services to that person, or vice versa. Whoever's using these services needs to have a clear control over the situation and not just the appearance of control, right? We talked about sometimes, different kinds of interpreting is just like, well, here you go. A lot of people feel like they have no control when actually they do, And I mean, I go back to my medical experience. A lot of people don't realize when a physician offers you a certain treatment plan, you don't have to do it. But a lot of people feel compelled to because they feel like they have no choice or autonomy in that matter. And it's like, no, you actually do. You're the boss in this relationship, And I think that's the issues that come up within these situations is we're already dealing with groups of people who are already at a disadvantage, I would say, because they don't speak English, right? So they're already in a position where they could be oppressed in different ways or taken advantage of in different ways. And then we're going to bring into this relationship I kind of think of it like the Wizard of Oz, like, who's the man behind the curtain, who's actually Oz, right? It's just this anomalous thing that's just here. And it's like, how is this going to help me? Right. So end user autonomy. The third principle, I already touched on the second one, is transparency of AI quality for the general public. So we talk about like kind of having like nutrition labels, what percentage of these languages were used to train this language model, right? Was it just English, or, how much Twi did you use in developing this? Or how much Afrikaans did you use? How much German? Right? What was used to develop this program? Who developed it? Where was it from? What were their ties? Were there any native users involved in the development of this? That kind of thing. And then we also talk about accountability by companies for errors and harm to end users. And this is a big one that's kind of being played out right now in real time. It would be very interesting to see what the courts decide in some of these cases. And it's unfortunate that we keep allowing courts to make all these decisions, but that's why we're pushing and lobbying for actual regulation to be developed by lawmakers, by legislators, because it's too much to have one court decision make an impact for the entire country based on one particular use case, because that could be misconstrued. So accountability, making sure who's responsible for this, right? Is it the person who purchased the AI devices or services? Is it the people who developed the AI services? Is it the people who maintain the services? Is it the person who's in the room using the services? And is it their fault? Who's at fault when things really hit the fan? Because we don't have that right now. AI is just this thing. But I think we saw that. Was it with an airline recently? I want to say, Holly, where somebody was able to get like free airlines or free car or something like that, and they totally manipulated the AI chatbot, or the AI chatbot messed up somehow, and the airline's like, well, that's not our fault. It was the AI chatbot.
Right.
And it's like, well, who's going to take accountability? It was your product that made these issues,
Absolutely. You've got all these people that, you look around and everybody's shrugging like, wasn't me. Like, okay, but somebody has to be responsible for this issue. And to reinforce that point, you hear a lot, and even in our name, we chose our name not thinking that this would be an issue. So forgive me, we are Safe AI, but everybody, has propagated that name, Safe, Responsible AI. And honestly, there's a difference between what we're asking for, which is accountability, and responsibility. Okay. And let me just put it in legal terms for you. And in general terms, a responsible person, if they, walk on your foot by mistake, will say, I'm sorry, and move on. But a person who is held accountable for that will be told, or will tell themselves, I need to look up more often from my cell phone and not be walking, and not paying attention to where I'm going. So I'm going to change my habits so as not to reproduce this error. And that's the basic difference that we're talking about, right? Legally, if you're held accountable, you're more likely or less likely to repeat that error. If you're just responsible, it's like, oops, sorry. Well, that does nothing for the person that you've harmed. I mean, I just saw on the news this morning that, a poor mother, her son fell in love with a chatbot, and the chatbot basically induced him to commit suicide. You can't just say, oops, sorry to that. That's the kind of harm that can happen in these situations if we're not checking all the boxes as far as accountability is concerned.
Well, Holly, that's a horrific happening. So this is where human oversight has to come in?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is why once we published the guidelines, we also did the second survey where we talk about, okay, what do we need to explain, or how do we get the message out to the consumer and out to the people who are potentially going to be buying services, right? To get them to think about these issues, because they're not. Right. For many years, we've been struggling with this in translation and interpretation. And come for me later. Some people would even say that we've contributed to it because the interpreter is supposed to be, behind the scenes, not make a scene, not be the center of attention, not talk about about what they're doing, and yes, confidentiality is important, but at the same time, educating the consumer suffered, I think, over time, because we became just the interpreter and this background thing. And so it's easy to replace that just the interpreter background thing with a robot if it's cheaper, right? Everybody has that mindset. The problem is that we're not just the interpreter, and we're not a thing. And we do provide much more than just, the transfer of message.
Shawn, let's talk about privacy and security within the guidance that was released.
We talk a little bit about that because, I think a lot of it lines into, like, I think about HIPAA. HIPAA is kind of like the one that we always refer to in general within the United States, the Health Insurance Portability Protection Act. It's really important to think about, where is this data being stored? Who has access to it? That's something that we often do not think about. Like, I usually teach like a HIPAA workshop for interpreters, and particularly for sign language interpreters. And, a lot of them are floored when they're like, oh, I can't use my Gmail account for HIPAA related stuff. I'm like, no, you can't. Because where do you think that data is stored? It's not stored on your servers. It's not secure. It's not on some secure portal that you're logging in and out of. It's information. You're violating HIPAA. You're potentially exposing people's information to the broader public. It's no different than if you had a bunch of documents sitting in your car and you open the windows and all the documents fly out of your car. It's the kind of the same thing. You're having that risk happen. With the AI, I think for us, we were more concerned about the end user autonomy, but we also positioned some questions for, we have sections called essential elements for purchasing and implementation, something for potential customers buying AI services, and helping them understand, okay, what are your, how much human interpreting is involved in this? How much oversight? We also talk about what are the metrics as far as accuracy. We also talk about the privacy and data integrity, what are those controls that they have? Because a lot of times they're on a server in a random place. And for healthcare in particular, we have very specific laws and regulations on where is that data stored. Did you have a BAA, a business associate agreement, executed with that particular vendor? That kind of thing. So we have to have, we've encouraged opt-in and opt-out languages or clauses with vendors, with end users. So if there is AI by AI being produced, they should be informed of their rights and having the ability to say, you know what, I actually don't want to use this service. I want to use another service. I would rather use a human interpreter on video remote interpreting, or RSI, or OPI, over the phone interpreting. We want people to have more options and understand what options they have, and not just given, like Holly mentioned, here you go.
So can we talk a little bit about where the interpreter falls into all of this? If an interaction, let's say, becomes more complicated than necessary, does the bot realize that it has become more complicated, or is the pressure put in on the end user to say, hey, we're not communicating, I want a live interpreter? Does a live interpreter then come on the line, and how does this interpreter get caught up with what had been said? There are all of these things. I imagine mechanisms could be created for a transcript that can be evaluated by the interpreter before coming in. But, the human oversight required at almost every step of this really needs to be well defined, I believe.
Oh, absolutely. In our latest research, which is automated speech-to-speech interpreting, and you can find that on the Safe AI website, there is a diagram there that talks about the whole spectrum, right? It goes from more human to more AI, left to right. You can have 100% interpreting by a human, but you can also have human interpreting with AI backup, like the interpreter encounters a technical difficulty or a terminology difficulty and the AI shoots in to help them out. You have human interpreting with CAI support, computer aided interpreting, where the AI is doing some of the, lifting some of the cognitive load, where you have maybe lots of addresses and names being thrown at you, and those are flashed up on a screen so that the interpreter doesn't have to use their memory at the same time as they're trying to transfer the message. You have human interpreting with AI validation to verify perhaps that the interpreter was accurate. You have AI interpreting with live human validation, which is the flip, right? The AI is doing it, and then the human can go, whoops, nope, that's not right. Let me just correct that right here. And AI interpreting with post-session human validating, or just 100%, like raw machine translation, 100% raw and, automated interpreting. And there's more options, I'm sure to come, depending on what the tech, bros come up with tomorrow. So this is a huge spectrum now, and it's not going away, right? It's not something where we can say, let's not talk about this because, they'll do their thing, we'll do ours. No, I think we're going to be much more intertwined than perhaps people might have thought at the beginning of this. It's not just a 100% human versus 100% automated option anymore. And that's why we want the consumer to know, here's your options. And also the person who's buying the services to know, is your use case, what's the best possible choice based on your particular use case? What do you want the end user to get out of this? What do you want to get out of this? And what's the best possible choice in that spectrum to provide the service that is so needed?
It sounds to me like we're also going to have to train interpreters and translators on what questions they ask of the people that they work for, the situations that they're going to be in, and how to address them. It's already complicated enough to be an interpreter with existing codes of ethics, and how it has an existing code of ethics in certain domains has not kept up with the changes in life, really. It's been probably 10 or 20 years since the legal code of ethics has been updated in certain, in certain realms. How do these guidances differ, if they do at all, between spoken language interpretation and ASL, Shawn?
I would say it only differs more in the sense of the modality, not so much the ethics. The ethics are going to basically be the same. We all want communicative autonomy. We all want privacy and security. We all want, complete access to healthcare, to education, to legal things. Those kinds of things are pretty much standard. I think sometimes we get too caught up in, sign language and spoken language, they're too different. There's differences, but not as much as we might think, because remember, in the brain, language is language. Doesn't matter the modality, right? It's really all about how does our brain process the information we're receiving. It's not really about how we receive that information as much. So I would say there's not as many differences as one would think. I would say that.
Holly, would you have anything to add regarding that?
I do think so. And I think that, we've also been very narrow in, and this is, one of the biases of the spoken world. We're very narrow in saying, ASL interpreting is the only type of interpreting for the deaf and hard of hearing world. There are 4 or 5 modalities, and not all of them are as visual. So like Shawn says, language is language. It's just a question of how it is being, forgive the term, interpreted in this particular situation. So yeah, the ethics I don't think are going to change. I do think that situationally there'll be issues. Yeah. And on the tech side, I think, like Shawn mentioned earlier, there's more of a moat. There's a higher barrier to be able to create something that will be of value to the community and will serve the same purpose. It won't be, and it still isn't as fluent at all, even with the lovely avatars that they've created, like he says, for 1 or 2 sentences. It's great, but they're way off and way behind in the research that's needed. And that's one of the things that's key. It's requiring something that is the most difficult thing that you can ask a computer to do, which is recognize the real world. Everyone, that facial recognition part that you see on TV, they're not there yet. I know you've been watching FBI, and every 5 seconds there's someone being facially recognized and then they throw them in jail. Not there yet. Okay. That's TV. That's not real life. It's the hardest thing to be able to have a computer do. Okay. Any kind of program. It doesn't know an apple is an apple, and it doesn't know it's different from anything else. And, the other thing is, we've seen since the 70s, those robotic arms and how they move things. Yes, that's very basic, and it can train it to do, put cars together, because that's metal. If you want it to pick up a glass of water, it has to apply the right amount of pressure. It has to recognize that it's water or an apple, and it can't be crushed, and it has to be put in a certain way. So it is enormously difficult. So that's going to take, I think, a long while before they can get to the point where the facial rec part of it is absolutely perfect. Now, going back to the fluency thing that, everybody seems to think is so wonderful, and making the spoken part a little bit more of a challenge for us to talk to people about. It's the best plagiarizer in the world. Of course it's fluent. It's human language it's using. It's just throwing it at you. It's not like it's just creating its own language. That's what people don't realize. It's data taken from really the best writers. Hello, it's the New York Times, Dickens, etc. So yeah, it's going to be great language. That's what always made me laugh. It's like, yeah, they took the data from like the best writers in the world. Duh, it's perfectly fluent. Yeah, doesn't mean it thinks. It's just this great plagiarism. It's just plopping this paragraph here and that word there and blah, blah, blah. And so I laugh when people say, oh, it's so wonderful. It think. No, it doesn't think. It doesn't think. It's just a plagiarizer and is reworking the words that humans have created.
I want to touch off that too. We have to remember language is based on culture. We are so quick to forget that. Mm-hmm. And the reason languages evolve is because culture and values and people evolve over time. The English we speak today is not the same that was used in the 1600s. We don't even speak the same English that was used a couple hundred years ago, even in America.
What
right?
saith thou, Shawn?
What saith I know, right? But it just shows how quick we are to minimize something that we take for granted. Speech, language, communication, sign languages, all these other modalities we use to communicate with one another. We're so quick to just be like, oh, it's a commodity. No, it's not. It's the most important thing as a human being you need. It impacts your physical health. It impacts your mental health. It impacts everything. It impacts your ability to have a job. It impacts your ability to have a family. It impacts everything. But that's one of the first things we minimize. I'm just the interpreter. Stop saying that. It is so important to understand what gift we have in communication, in language, because when you've worked with people who have been language deprived, like many deaf people around the world are, because of different cultural beliefs or religious beliefs or the like, those poor people, when they finally get access to communication, to language, and start developing it, they blossom into these wonderful people, but they've been husk of themselves because they didn't have that language. And that's something that AI is not there yet. Maybe one day it'll have understanding of culture and languages. Like, we're all linguists, we all understand things, right? Just in American Sign Language, there's like 10 signs for the word hospital. How is an AI going to understand that without knowing, oh, this person has a particular dialect. Okay, they're from New York City. I can tell from how they sign. Um, when I worked with a lot of Spanish interpreters, they would tell me, like, I have to figure out what country they're from because there are certain words I cannot use with
Oh,
this
yeah.
country because it'll piss them off. But with this group of people, totally fine, right? Just random words, right? And that's culture. Things change over time.
And not to mention body,
Yeah.
posture, body language, expressions, micro expressions, all of these things which us as human beings capture in microseconds. I can tell, just by looking at you, I can tell whether you agree with me or you don't agree with me, or whether I'm starting to annoy you, or whether, you're really holding yourself back from interrupting or not, or any of these things. And it can't do those things, right? At
Right.
least not yet.
Not yet. I want to point out too, COVID. What did we learn from COVID? I saw so many people struggle with communication with mask on. And I think people didn't realize how much we relied on facial expressions, even for English speaking. And it really, people were like, wait, what did you say? You could hear them, but because you didn't have your eyesight to help you understand what that person was saying, it changed everything. And it took people months to get used to speaking to each other with mask on, right? I know it took me a long time, but me and the deaf people, we were fine because we were used to having some kind of issues and things like that. And a lot of our language we can use our eyebrows a little bit more and our eyes a little bit more to figure things out, right? It was very interesting to see that just from coming from a sign language perspective.
Oh, when you look at from a linguist's perspective, 90%, people don't realize 90% of your communication is body language. 90%, 10% is the words, right? Across languages, they've done studies. That always shocks people when I'm doing trainings. I'm like, no, you gotta actually, have the right body language that matches, right? Which is why when you're doing it on text, you don't get tone, because tone is a lot of body language, isn't it?
It's so easy to misconstrue a text thinking, that there may be sarcasm involved or some other emotion that in fact isn't really there, just because of a misplaced exclamation point or a capital letter. If you have all caps on automatically, sorry, I didn't mean to scream at you.
Right.
So how can we maintain linguistic diversity and ensure quality in an AI-driven world? I mean, that's a huge question, but I bring it up because we have been also, we've started to look at, here at Subject to Interpretation, we recently had an episode with Odilia Romero from My Cielo, and we were trying to introduce to our general public more to the concepts and the things that indigenous interpreters have to contend with, as well as users of indigenous interpretation. So, there's so many dialects, there's so many regionalisms. There are, just as Shawn has mentioned, and you have mentioned, there in ASL and in the deaf of hard of hearing community, there are so many modalities of communication, spelling, hand spelling.
SEE, right?
Yes, exactly. Transliteration, a whole bunch of, how do we tackle this?
Well, to say something good about AI, right? There have been cases, and there still are, where AI is being used to help endangered languages, right? Research is being done to encapsulate it so that it can be taught to the next generation. Because as we lose our speakers of a language, right, it dies. What's the statistic? Like one language a week or something like that goes by the wayside. It's really tragic. So that's one of the fantastic uses. They are doing a lot of research now on trying to get the data for languages of lesser diffusion. In the spoken world, I can't speak to the signed language world and the variations thereof, but I know that, you know, like Black ASL and things like that are issues, right? When we're talking about the avatar being able to interpret the regional nature of things. But on the spoken side, they're doing that research. I have seen, and I am certainly not a tech bro. I did do a little coding, but boy, am I not a tech bro. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt. They are working on trying to create more data, right? Artificial data that is not captured in the real world, to give the machine enough to work with to make it viable for the languages of lesser diffusion, right? Because it's all a question of what data is it trained on. If there's no data, well, then there's not going to be that particular language isn't going to be served. And that is one of the weaknesses of this AI. You know, it's great for Spanish, it's great for English, but you know, it gets less great as we go down the European languages, you know, like French, less so, German, even less so, Polish, not so much, you know, because there's just not enough data out there. And I think that's also one of the issues too with ASL. I don't mean to speak for Shawn, but there isn't enough video out there that they've captured of all of these different dialects that can make it a viable data to input and allow the computer to actually, you know, sort through and go, oh, okay, that's New York, because that's the sign for New York Hospital. And at this point, I think they're working on that problem, but it is not something that is going to be solved in the immediate future, I think. So it is one of the weaknesses, right? And that's ironic, because one of the things we found in our survey is, in addition to cost, right, cost-saving measures, a lot of companies were so excited because they thought it could be applied to find that unicorn purple, you know, interpreter that nobody can find, that's like Swahili and, you know, Zapotec, right? Like, nope, that doesn't exist. Sorry, not even in the computer. But they want to be able to fulfill the need with something that actually isn't ready to fulfill that need, right? It's really strongest in, you know, the language it's been trained on. And hello, the internet is what, 95% English or something like that, you know, and that's where they're pulling they're doing the web crawl to pull that data from there. So I've yet to see a Swahili website. I don't know. Somebody want to send me one? Please be sure to send me one. But that's why there isn't a lot of, you know. And what about the languages? We haven't even talked about the languages that are oral. Hello, where are they pulling that data from? And who's typing it out, right? We saw what the Portuguese did to Vietnamese. Good God, you know. So are they going to then force it to be a written language? Interesting perspective, right?
Shawn?
I mean, I agree with everything that Holly has been saying. I really don't have much to add, other than if you want to ensure that if you want to ensure linguistic diversity and you're somebody who speaks what I would say a language of lesser diffusion within the United States, your language might be actually more widely used in another country or something. If you really want to preserve it, start creating content in that language, video, audio, written, in all of the formats, and just start creating that content in that language. Get native users of that language to produce more content, because if you want to preserve it, that's the only way it's going to be preserved, at least if you want to include it in the AI future that's coming very rapidly for us.
I mean, we live in a digital world.
Yeah,
so.
And
exactly.
therefore, are you saying that once that content is created, then it'll be mined and then it will be included?
Yes.
Yeah.
Does this represent a new opportunity for interpreters and linguists in terms of employment purposes?
Oh, I think it's going to, this particular thing of creating content, absolutely. If you want to create content in your native tongue and there's not a lot out there, go get them because this is the time. And eventually, we hope that it may turn into, you know, something that's financially viable too, because these companies, although now they're scraping the data, we don't know what the lawsuit with the New York Times is going to do. whether copyright will be upheld or not. And if it is, then you're going to be paid for that data. So why not create it now and hope for the best? But at the same time, the interpreter's job into another, spectrum of things that you can do. I've seen ads for prompt engineer linguist come out now, right? I've seen ads for natural language specialist, which I think is a different meaning in the computer world. So don't get confused and like, I'm a native speaker, natural language is my thing. No, that's a different thing. But still, if you have some computer experience and are an interpreter, I think there's a lot of opportunity there to maybe, take a left turn in your career and go more to the tech side. So this is creating other job opportunities for sure. But it's the same as any tech interruption. Those people who are sort of perhaps at the end of their career, the tail end, may not be benefiting from the possibility of, switching to a new career because of the ageist society that we live in, right? So there is that element of fear, I think, amongst a certain number of interpreters because they're in that, slim group that may not benefit from the new possibilities. It is an interesting time, to say the least, I guess is what I would have to say.
I'd like to see the day when, in addition to Chief Technology Officer and Chief Financial Officer, we have Chief Language Officer as a required or as a role that occurs in order to merge the tech with the language and show that there's this interest and this value placed on languages themselves. Shawn, what kinds of recommendations do you have for those who are maybe even just listening and hearing about this for the first time in this podcast and are starting to be concerned about what their place and their role is going to be forthcoming in this profession?
Well, I would say don't be a passive person. Be somebody who is active. Speak to your local legislators, speak to anybody who will listen about what the potential harms of AI and the benefits of AI could do, in particular to your field. I've said this before with different people and on other settings. We need to take a lesson from accountants and tax preparers and the like, because we've had Excel and QuickBooks for how many decades, and yet they keep growing as an industry, right? It's literally just math. They don't do language, they do math. It is literally what computers do best, but they are growing. Why is that? They know how to pivot. They know how to use it. To the average person, they view Excel, QuickBooks, and that like, okay, that's my CPA's job. That's their tool. I just put in some data and they crunch the numbers. They do their thing with it, right? We need to position AI, machine translation, large language models that can do interpretation and all that. We need to say, hey, this is a tool. It's a great tool, but it's for us to use because we're professionals. We know what to do with it. Don't hand me a hammer and say, Shawn, build me a house, because I'm not going to be able to do that for you. I'm going to struggle really bad. I'm going to try to do my best, but it's going to be a mess. So we should position that with the average consumer, the average vendor who's looking to buy language services. And it's like, look, you can do this. You can, but you're going to call me in a little bit because you're going to want me to come and fix your house. You're going to want me to come and fix your books. You're going to want me to come and fix your language issues because I'm the professional, I'm the linguist, I'm the trained person. I went to school for this. I work with people who do this. I'm in this industry. This is a tool for me to use. If you want to learn it, by all means, go for it. But you need to really go dive into it. And our society right now, the way the economy is globally, we're all specialists now. None of us can be generalists. We all have to be specialists because we don't have the time to devote to become a generalist in every single thing that we need to have experience and knowledge in, honestly.
And Holly, what would your take on this be?
I think you're right in the sense that we do need to specialize, but we also need to learn, we as interpreters need to learn a little bit more about the business side and a little bit more about the tech side, because it is a give and take. We can't just be, like you said, completely passive or stick our heads in the sand like the translators did years ago. You do have to be active about this. We are right now in the cycle where we're catching our breath. We've seen the disruption and we have to pivot. And I think Safe AI will pivot to, now let's talk about how to get the policy and the law to catch up with the tech. That's been the case with every technological thing. We have a challenge because we need to then educate the general public as to, yes, this is a great thing. Much like the calculator was a fabulous invention. The T1 calculator saved me from calculus. Thank you, Lord. But at the same time, there are some real problems with this. And unless we address it and put some guardrails, we're going to have a really rough ride. So we're pivoting now towards educating the consumer about, what do we need as far as policy? Why is our policy sort of veering differently? And it has to do with the perspective, right? In the American side, it's you need to provide language access. This is the law. And that's and you're breaking the law and civil rights. That's the focus, because that's where our language access laws come in. Whereas on the European side, they're much more, there's no language access. I mean, I've lived there and it was like, welcome to Paris, get your language on because we don't have interpreters for you. Go to the bank and figure it the hell out, So their perspective is more, okay, how can I make the data secure? Because that's where their laws, right, around security are touching AI. I believe we have to merge both in this country, and we have to start understanding that you taking my data is not free. And it's not implied consent. You need to ask and pay. Thank you. So that's where we're headed. And I think it's going to be a bit of a battle.
How can our listeners and interested parties get involved with Safe AI?
Join our stakeholder group. We're in the process of trying to also become a formalized organization. We're working in the background to try and figure out whether we want to be a 503c, a 503(6), all of that. Once we've gotten, that out of the way, join our organization, educate yourself about the policy proposals that are out there, because there are some. There are states, that have already passed laws like Tennessee that say your voice is your voice. They can't record you and use it for AI unless they ask. But that's only one state, right? We need broad federal protections for things like that. So you need to know the policy that is being proposed in your local legislature and in the federal legislature. And you need to know the positions of the people that you're voting for. Vote in a few days. So, and this is an issue that I vote on. I go to my local, senator and say, hey, I'm a constituent. What do you think of this? And if they don't know, I educate them what they should think. And I think that a lot more people need to be doing that.
Shawn?
I just want to encourage everyone to go to safeaitf.org. Sign up, you get alerts through your news. We send out email alerts and things like that. Look over the surveys that we've put out. Look over the guidance that we published. If you are motivated to take some action, please join us, join the stakeholder assembly. We have committee positions open. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. Like Holly mentioned, we have an organization to stand up. The work's not going to end. And something that I would say to people is indecision is still a decision. The failure to act is still a decision. You're still doing something. It's just maybe it's not something positive. So if you are somebody who is invested as an interpreter, as a language service company owner, or involved in the business in some way, or as an end user, somebody who's a patient, somebody who's a family member, maybe you have some sort of connection to the language access industry in general, I encourage you to please support Safe AI, the Safe AI Task Force, and get familiar with what we're doing. Promote us on social media so that more and more people can see what we're talking about, and so that those legislators, those regulators can understand more and more how important it is that we start to put some guardrails on this stuff, not just for us as a benefit as our industry, but really more for a protection to the general public. And that's really what we're trying to focus on, is what it could do to the general public.
Holly Silvestri and Shawn Norris, thank you so much for joining us here on Subject to Interpretation. Really appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
To our listeners, I encourage you to engage with Safe AI's work and be part of the conversation shaping the future of interpreters. Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for our next episode. And as always, never stop learning.